Welcome to Rock Docs. I'm David Lizerbram here with, what's his name?
Andrew Keatts.
And we are here today to talk about The Sparks Brothers, a book, a movie about a pair of brothers named Sparks. Most of those things are not true. The Sparks
2021,
Brothers,
Edgar Wright.
there you go. About the band Sparks, Ron and Russell Mel. They are, in fact, brothers. What was your relationship with Sparks prior to this movie dropping?
Virtually non-existent. Virtually non-existent.
Okay.
I think like many people, and I'm emboldened by the number of accounts I've read that are essentially on the lines of mine, which is I don't know that I knew a single Sparks song. I knew that there was a band called Sparks that was very influential and was like sought after by record collectors, and critics loved them, and that there was. I'd read interviews where musicians cited them, but I personally had no relationship whatsoever with Sparks.
Okay. Best of your knowledge, you had not heard a Sparks song.
To the best of my knowledge, I had not heard a Sparks song.
Like, it wasn't like you watched the movie, you're like, oh, that one.
No, this most recent time going through it, I was trying to think really hard. I was like, are any of these songs familiar? And I don't think any of them were. No.
Okay.
What about yourself?
Yeah, I was not a Sparks head before watching the movie. I had listened to some of the music. I mean, they were one of these bands that like everybody talks about. They're influential, blah blah blah. So I had made an effort from time to time to like check it out, and I was always like, I kind of get it. I kind of not sure. It's not that I don't like it, but it never grabbed me in the way that like I dug deep. So I would listen to a few songs and be like, that's interesting, and then like, any social situation or something with another human happens that wasn't the right fit, and then moved on. The only song that I had a relationship with was the song Never Turn Your Back on Mother Earth, because Nico Case covered that on her album from about 10 years ago. I think it was Middle Cyclone, and I really liked her cover. So then I went back and I did at the time listen to the original, which I dug. But that was, that's really the only one that I probably could have, like, if forced to, come up with, This Town Ain't Big Enough for the Both of Us, or like a couple names of songs. But, but beyond that, I couldn't, I didn't know that it was Ron and Russell. Like, I think I maybe knew they were brothers, but I didn't know a whole lot about it.
Yeah, so I frankly I felt pretty insufficient with my lack of familiarity, and I guess my question is, two guys like us, our British counterparts, would they be in a considerably different position? Is the Sparks popularity in the UK such that two music fans who are not necessarily Sparks head would just have a base level understanding that's higher than what we have?
I think so, because the movie has a lot of appearances that they made on Top of the Pops.
Mm-hmm.
And, they go out of their way to really tell how popular that show was, where there's like, a quarter of the population of England at any point in the 70s or 80s would have been watching that show. So like, it seems kind of unavoidable, like almost like somebody who's really huge on MTV in the 80s. And like, even if you weren't really a fan, you couldn't, it was just in your face.
Right.
So from that perspective, I think that probably the Brits are more familiar with Sparks than of our ilk. Maybe not a 22-year-old Brit, but somebody in their 30s or 40s.
Well, so before we get into them, this movie. So this movie is coming up on 1 year old. This came out just before we began this program, and my relationship with this movie was that it was a pretty quick turnaround from when it came out, 2-3 weeks, that people started talking about it. And I started, whether it was on Twitter or other music people I knew, asking me if I had watched it yet. So I think I watched it within the first month or so, and it instantly had infinitely increased my level of awareness of Sparks upon watching this movie. And it came with a sort of headline director as well.
Yeah, I mean, I also checked it out as soon as it was available, because I was like anticipating it, and
you were anticipating it. You were watching.
Well, I mean, I'd heard about
schedule.
Yeah, yes, exactly. No, I mean, I'd heard that Edgar Wright had this documentary coming out about
Mhm.
Sparks, and I was like, all right, that's a band I always wanted to check out. Check out Edgar Wright.
Right.
I like a lot of his movies. Sounds like this could be cool. I'm known to like music documentaries. You may have heard.
Right.
So, yeah, and I mean, cards on the table. I will say that the of the movies that have come out kind of since we started this about a year ago, the big ones, the Get Backs, the Velvet Undergrounds, the Summers of
Right.
Soul,
Yeah.
the Geniuses.
Yeah.
Um, like uh, this may be my personal. This is probably the one that I've watched the most. Like I've watched this
Yeah.
like 5 times.
Right.
Like I love this movie, and so I don't. This might be my fan favorite of all those.
Well,
I'm not gonna sit
it,
here and like try to debate if it's better than Get Back or something, but like
well,
it's a killer.
it's funny. The first time I watched it, I was sort of delighted by it and I liked it, but I don't know that I thought I was going to watch it uh, much more. And it didn't entice me to get into Sparks on that first watch.
Hmm.
And then about like 6 months later, I watched it with my mother-in-law, and she was delighted by it. And sort of seeing it from somebody else's eyes, I started thinking like, this really is an interesting movie. It gave me a second perspective on it, and I was like, they really are doing some interesting things with this whole rock doc here. And then on rewatch for this episode was when I really fell head over heels, and it was like on the third watch that I realized that the rewatchability of this movie was very high, and that the shopping cart was headed down the hill. We were picking up speed, and I was going to continue watching this movie many times into the future.
You were a Sparks Brothers guy. There's no way
Yeah,
around it.
and yeah, now Sparks Brothers are all up in my Spotify playlist.
This all right, let's get into this. So
Yeah,
this is a fair in some ways fairly conventional in the
yeah,
sense that it's like a whole history of this band. The band is Ron and Russell Mael. They are they're prior to this I really had made an effort at some point to kind of look up like who is Sparks, what is the deal, and there was not a lot of information about them then.
yeah.
um it's kind of hard to reproduce that now that the movie's out and they're in this movie talking about themselves for 2 hours, and there's been a lot written about it and so forth. So that mystery kind of is gone. So you'll just have to trust me. But it really goes through their whole lives up to basically like when the movie comes out, and they've had a very long career. Their music recording career started in the '60s and continues to this day. They've never stopped. It's always been the two of them and various band members coming and going. And a lot of people thought they were a British band. They're two kind of oddball Jewish brothers from Southern California, and um, the I think for fans of music documentaries, the movie has a lot of Easter eggs, kind of, and sort of plays off the tropes of the music documentary a lot.
Yeah,
So,
right.
if you're not really a music documentary person and you turn on the movie, maybe there's some element of that just seems like there's a lot of things happening that don't really make sense. But if you're ahead ahead like we are, um, he has Edgar and the guys have a lot of fun with the conventions of the form.
Right. Yeah, it's a superficially conventional rock doc, and it breaks with convention only in sort of like the details and the tone. And it's the detail and the tone that create sort of a send up of it, which is in some ways very Edgar Wright. I mean that's pretty much what, like, I don't know, Hot Fuzz and Shaun of the Dead are, kind of, right?
It's Scott Pilgrim to an extent.
And
Yeah,
Scott
yeah,
Pilgrim, yeah,
sure.
yeah. And and that stuff's fun and it's rewarding, and it kind of builds over the course. I'll also say, outside of any sort of stylistic flourish, using fans as part of your army of talking heads, and not like famous fans, just fans,
Yeah,
um, intermingled in along with Flea and Jason Schwartzman,
right.
is a fantastic touch. And that, there's like a little a little sense of humor in that it has the years. The fans are the chyron for the fans includes like the years during which they were a fan, which is kind of a funny idea of like
Right.
that
Yeah.
it's like
They might have been a fan from 1977 to 1982.
yeah, they got off the boat, like that.
Yeah,
That's
that's fine.
a funny little touch. But using actually, I mean, it's sort of it's something we see a lot of in these festival docs, or we've been seeing it lately. We
Right.
commended Summer of Soul for doing that, but it's interesting treating them as authorities on the matter to have a full talking head segment to talk about what it is that they liked about the band, just like you would normally have for Anthony Kiedis or whoever.
Right. The movie treats the fan, the sort of unknown fan people, with more respect than it treats the very famous people that are interviewed. These super famous musicians. The Flea, Mike Myers, Weird Al. All those people are sort of, even Edgar Wright himself are the butt of the joke.
Yes.
To some extent, and the fans are given some respect.
Well, and so not only is that a cool touch to do on its face, and not only is there a little twist on it by, sort of being playful about what's the difference between these expert talking heads and a fan, but it's also useful in that specific subject matter here because the type of band that they are so lends themselves to the opinions of the obsessive individual fan, much like a Grateful Dead or Fish or something like that, right? That like
a ween,
a ween. Like you actually want to hear from those Guided by Voices, right? Like you actually want to hear from those people. Those people, like they have so many albums,
right?
That your casual but famous person is going to have much less to say than the obsessive.
Right. Who is deranged enough to have listened to and have opinions about every Guided by Voices album? You would have to be a truly sick person.
You have to be a real sicko, yes.
Or to have gone to like hundreds of Fish shows.
Right.
Really, just somebody who needs medical attention. And Sparks have kind of like that. I mean, they have like 27 albums. One thing the movie does that's very interesting is that every single album, essentially, and every phase of their career is given the same amount of attention and respect. This is not one of those movies where like you see the couple of greatest hits type albums that a band does, and then it's like it zips through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s to today, which is a lot of music documentaries. This one, like he's as interested in some album that really didn't do very well in 1995 as something that's more well known from the 70s or something more contemporary. Like it goes right up to today, and it's all interesting. It never gets boring, because the guys are so weird.
Yeah. So 100%. I mean, some of the docs we've seen in the past that sort of do the full blow by blow of every album.
Yeah.
Like Petty did that, right?
But to an extent.
For the most part, in a doc like this, you get eras. There's the first album, and then there's a whirlwind, and we're in a montage for the second, for the follow up and the critically acclaimed third album, and then there's a middle period for the career wane, the mid career wane, and then they overstate the greatness of the late career works or whatever. Here we actually get the same level of blow by blow for every album, but I will say it changes a little bit maybe towards the end, and maybe you disagree with this, but it's more like table setting about each album. They don't actually get into the production process or any sort of specifics about the creation of each album or how the songwriting process went, how the production went. It's sort of like, here's what we were thinking of at this point, here's where our career was at this point, and then here's some reaction for the album. There's no making of footage of any of these albums, really, particularly early career. You know what I mean?
Right. It's not. I mean, a lot of things are. This is a 2-hour, 20-minute movie where they go through these two guys like basically whole lives. They're now in their 70s or whatever.
It's pretty long.
And they go through the whole thing, but it's very. I mean, you hear very little about their personal lives. And even the internal like thought behind the music and the albums is really not the point. It really is about their external experience, how they were how the public received them,
Mm-hmm.
and how they just kept on going. Basically, it's like the story
Yeah.
of persistence.
Yes.
And I guess I should just say, like, if people haven't seen the movie and aren't particularly familiar with Sparks,
Yeah.
we should just say, there's these two guys, Ron and Russell. Ron is the composer. He writes all the music and lyrics. He plays the keyboards. He looks like Hitler. He he has a Hitler
Charlie
mustache through
Chaplin.
most of the career, or Charlie Chaplin, if you're being generous. And he wears a suit typically, or some kind of formal wear, and he just like gives weird looks and sits at the piano. His younger brother Russell, is a much more conventionally handsome, great hair.
Kind of ripped at different parts. There's a couple times
kind
I'm
of
like,
ripped.
looking,
A bit of a ladies' man. The only parts of it that they get into their personal lives is a little bit of allusion to him being a bit of a ladies' man.
yes.
He's the singer. He has a almost like Freddie Mercury type voice in terms of the vocal range.
Yeah.
And even now, like when you hear like the new like contemporary concert footage, or whatever, like he's retained that into his 70s. Like he's not lost a bit, a bit of it, as far as I can tell. And the music is a combination typically of rock with sometimes, as time goes on, some electronic elements like in the 80s and 90s, but also kind of like Queen in a way. Like that's sort of like sometimes it's vaudevillian, sometimes it's film music inspired, sometimes it's operatic.
Very theatrical. Yeah.
Very theatrical. It has that theater kid energy a little bit.
It does.
But it doesn't ever feel try-hardy.
Right.
Because the lyrics all have like a Steely Dan level of irony to them.
Yes.
Where there's a character.
And humor, but more humor than like Steely Dan is like you smirk because you're pleased with yourself that you realized the irony. And don't get me wrong, I'm a real satisfied prick when it comes to listening to Steely Dan, so I don't mean that pejoratively.
Same right here.
but like this is like genuinely funny, I think, in a way that's a little bit different than Steely Dan. Closer to Ween, I would say, or Talking Heads maybe. Like openly funny.
Yeah. Right. It's meant to be like it's just one of these things where you could just look at it and it's funny. Or you can dig into it and become an obsessive and find all kinds of layers and things in the songs. Ron being this kind of weirdo, composing the songs for Russell to sing, explicitly treats him like a puppet sometimes.
Yes.
And so Russell will be this real smooth character singing about how he can't get the girl, and you feel like it's Ron speaking through Russell, but some people
think I'm kind of handsome from afar. Which is just a very funny line that resonates.
Yeah.
How you feel.
And then there's this interview at one point in the movie. I think this would have been in the 80s, where there's tons and tons of footage. One thing that's there is just a blessing that they have is there is tons of footage. They did apparently every TV show in England and Europe and in America as well, but also Germany and France or whatever. Like anytime they were asked to be on TV from like 1970 to today, they did it, and it's all there. So there's tons of like really weird, awkward, goofy interviews and like live performances where they're clearly lip syncing and bits they were doing. But there's one point where like they ask Ron about the band, and Ron recites in this deadpan tone, and I wrote this down: Sparks is a rock band with a point of view. The thing that we wish to convey is a sense of joy about the music that we are creating. And I think that most of this sense of joy is from Russell's singing and from my lyrical approach, sometimes satirical, but never without some sort of witty point of view. Which is just like, it sounds like he's just repeating something that a PR person wrote about them, or something was the back of the album, and he's kind of winking at the camera. And it's not really clear that the host, of the show gets that this is intended to be a joke. Like they're always doing a joke on the host of the show. It's great.
They are, and I sort of anticipated them being a bit more acerbic than they are. As the movie goes on and you spend more time with them, and then I listened to a couple interviews with them after the fact, one specifically on the Rolling Stone podcast, which was very good. Edgar Wright was there with them as well. They're sweetheart guys. They're not mean-spirited at all. which it would be. I mean, the music is so layered in irony and sort of like not necessarily. It's not cuddly, the humor is not
Right.
cuddly, and so you might think that they're sort of sharp tongued, and they at least from what I could tell, they seem not to be at all.
Yeah, nobody has the slightest negative thing to say about them.
No,
And
yeah,
all their former like they have a tendency, Sparks, these two guys, to like pick up a band, get a band together, do some albums, do concerts around the world, and then one day fire the whole band and go do something completely different.
yeah,
And they interviewed tons of these former bandmates who were just like essentially almost left on the side of the road.
yeah.
For
Well, and
years.
there's this recurring motif with the band where they do something that a lot of people really like, and
Yeah.
they instantaneously are like, we must follow this up with something very different.
Yes.
And then the next album lands with a thud, and the band that put those two albums together, maybe it's 3 albums together, becomes completely, it breaks apart, and they start on a new thing. And there's like 5 ups and downs like this over the course of their 27 album run, and now I would say it's possible that I don't have a well-crafted enough ear to pick up on it, but I don't actually think their sound changes as much as their fans in this movie suggest that their sound is changing over the course of it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I think it all carries through. The songwriting is very consistent.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it changes in the sense that stuff they were doing in 1972 sounds different than stuff they're doing in 1985, which is true for almost anybody.
Right.
And I think looking back on it now, it all kind of sounds like, well, we know what Bob Dylan sounded like in 1972 and then 1985. And like, so we accept that like an artist can have their essence come through with some surface differences in terms of the technology. And maybe at the time it just sounded more shockingly different.
Yeah,
Because if you're only paying attention to them from time to time and you listen to them at one point and then you catch up with another song 8 years later, because all of a sudden there's a new song on the radio or you see them on TV, it's going to sound radically different. But if you see the evolution, maybe not.
Yeah, and it's funny, there's a couple different, the famous talking heads. I think Scott Aukerman says something along these lines, where it's like they check out on them, and then like 8 years later they're like, oh my God, Sparks is back. I didn't realize Sparks was still doing it.
And they never went away.
Yeah. I want to go back to the sense of humor that they have, though, because it's interesting to me so one, Flea has a great quote in it where he says, there's a sort of inability in music to take humor seriously.
Yeah.
And, there's a sort of there's a self-reference there that certainly Red Hot Chili Peppers always tried to be funny in some ways.
Wait, what?
Right. But like, I'm thinking about bands I like Talking Heads and Fish, that are bands that try to be funny from time to time, or have their own I shouldn't say try to be funny, that have their own internal sense of humor. And that internal sense of humor is almost like a language that is shared between the band and the fans that is very difficult to translate to non-fans, because it's so specific, and it's the specificity that makes it funny. And like, some of the songs, like for instance, they do a collaboration with Franz Ferdinand, and when they send the track over to him, the track that they send is just collaborations don't work or something like that.
Right. Yeah, the song's called Collaborations Don't Work.
Collaborations don't work. And it's like, it's just this little, like, if you're into Sparks, I have no doubt that the second you heard that, you're just like, haha, those guys, I love those guys, they're great, but like, it might not be necessarily laugh out loud funny to somebody who doesn't understand that band, right? And their ability or their willingness to just lean into that for 40 years, 50 years, I guess at this point, is refreshing and interesting. And one of the things that I think the movie does a really good job of sort of reflecting back in the style of the movie itself, and explaining throughout the course of the movie as well.
Yeah, I have a theory that is to call it half-baked would be to overstate the amount of baking that's been done.
Sure.
But I'm now going to elaborate on that nonetheless. So when I was talking to some friends about this movie and trying to explain to them like why they would like it, these are friends who are like me, Jewish, and I was like, yeah, these are two Jewish guys, and they're kind of like the Coen brothers of music. Like they are brothers who seem to communicate in their own language, and there's no way you can really tell there's no gap between their sensibilities, and what they're doing is totally unique and weird, and sometimes it's commercially successful and sometimes it's not, but they seem very confident, and there's a lot of weird humor, and they're not afraid to be off-putting. um and And so that's one comparison. They also mention in the movie that they like the Marx Brothers. They're very influenced by the Marx Brothers. I see a little bit of that. And then the other thing that I thought of when you're talking about humor in music, and I just thought of that now, is the Beastie Boys, who
Very
were very commercially successful, but always or very often trying to be funny. Sometimes successful, sometimes not, whatever, some people like it, some people don't, same as anything. You see Flea in this movie, you see Weird Al. Those are, Weird Al obviously is trying to be a comedy artist the whole time. That's, no slam on Weird Al, but that's clearly what he's putting forward. But I don't think people would say like the Beastie Boys are a comedy act. You know what I mean? But like really they are. Even the Beatles had a lot of comedy in them.
Absolutely.
But yeah, there is definitely a strain of Jewish humor that comes through in Sparks, where there's an irony that is a way of talking about dark subjects, and a sort of insularity. Like if you get where we're coming from, great, you're part of the group, and if you don't get it, you're just never going to get it, and you're not invited in. I mean, yeah, you could say that about Fish or Ween or other. It's not exclusively a Jewish thing, but there is a strain of that comes from the Marx, that goes through the Marx Brothers, through these guys that I can definitely.
Fish covers Alvinu Malkenu, buddy.
Well, there you go. Great, fabulous.
All right. Yeah. So anyway, I thought that Flea quote was great. In fact, I have to say, Flea is a really good talking head.
Flea's good.
Flea was a really good talking head. So
one thing about Flea. Hold on, let me just say one thing that I noticed about Flea in this movie. Yeah. So one thing this movie has is extreme visual consistency and a real aesthetic, and that is a real skill because you're taking footage and photos from 70 years. Pulling it together, and stuff that you're shooting now, and it all seems harmonious. And we watch tons of music documentaries that do not accomplish that, where they take, it just looks like a hodgepodge. Edgar Wright did an incredible job of making this all look like a piece. Yeah, but the things that he shot, the interviews that he shot with the talking heads, they're all in black and white, and everybody, I guess, was instructed to wear black. Like a black shirt or something like that. So every single talking head you see is wearing black, and they all kind of have this look. And then Flea is wearing like a Cosby sweater. He just could not do it.
He just couldn't follow the directions. Yeah. So I didn't pick up on this because I'm not that smart. I don't want to give it away. We've got this podcast. I guess part of the premise is that I am, but I'm not. But the framing, the shot and the color scheme for all of the Talking Head segments is the cover of Big Beat of the Sparks album Big Beat, which was
I didn't even notice that either.
Sort of their punk influence. So if you look at it, it's black and white. It looks perfect. It looks exactly like the thing. And so Edgar Wright said he was consciously doing that because he thinks it's so funny how obviously posed it is in a rock doc when you've got the one person who's clearly staged in front of the soundboard, and the other person who's clearly staged in front of his gold records, and the other person who's clearly staged on his back
at a piano.
At his piano. What if we did it instead where it's all staged to look exactly the same like one of their record covers?
That is so funny. Yeah, I didn't get that. That's great.
Good. This is why we got this show, baby.
There's so much in this movie. That's why it's worth watching over and over again. Like a lot of the times when they're talking about something that happened in the past, rather than just have the two guys as a talking head, There are these adorable cartoons of
Yes,
them,
yes, yes.
and they're always hilarious.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're also like what's it called, like puppets, like where you're
Yeah. Yeah.
stop motion animation puppets. But a lot of times these little cartoons and they're it's almost like the Far Side. It kind of looks like that, and they're always the butt of the joke. It's just
I got to tell you,
hilarious.
I had a volcanic laughter. The end bit where Russ takes you to his coffee shop and he says he's or excuse me, is it,
Earth Cafe.
yeah, at Earth Cafe, and he says, I come here every day for a little peace and quiet, and I drink by myself, and then one day per week Ron comes as well, and it pans and Ron's doing his classic like look over through the mirror. Like I didn't see that coming at all. It was so perfectly staged. I cracked up. So they also one of the other things that they do a good job of explaining is how the sort of the band's sensibility was so portrayed through their album covers.
Right.
Their album covers were almost like Edgar Wright described it as stills from a movie that didn't exist.
Mm.
And that like each one had this really specific story. And they even, I think, is it Neil Gaiman, the author who is talking about I think it's Propaganda is one of their
Yeah.
albums. And there's the front cover, back cover, and middle cover are three different places with both of them
Tied up, kidnapped.
like they're kidnapped. And he wrote a story in his head that they were on this boat, and they looked like they were going to get thrown out, but they managed not to. And then they're in the trunk of a car going to somewhere else, which turns out to be this hotel. And now they're getting out at this point.
Right. And there's a phone when they're like lying in the hotel room. There's a phone right near them, and it looks like Russell might be able to get out of the ropes.
Yes, and so Neil Gaiman takes from this a inspirational story that they've worked together to stay alive, and now they may get out of this. And Edgar Wright points out, well, you could just reverse the order of those photos, and this could be a really grim ending. And
Neil says that's why you're a film director.
That's why you're a director. Yeah. Which that's a great little bit of rock doc serendipity. But the album covers are great, and so then between that and their stage presence, which is sort of wild, Queen-like, I guess, Beatles-like in certain ways, I guess. They actually they describe it as the Who. They say the Who was really the inspiration for their stage performance.
Yeah, Russell says in the early days, he said, I tried to be like Mick Jagger or Roger Daltrey, and I missed the mark by a couple thousand miles. But you can definitely see, yeah, I mean, it's definitely that classic. I mean, they're clearly putting on a performance. This is not a band where it's like they shuffle on stage wearing their regular clothes and like, okay, well, we'll play some music for you. Like, it's always a theatrical event. Even this is definitely a lot of rock docs have a big chunk of live footage of the band at the time the documentary is being filmed.
Yes.
Right? That's a common trope in rock docs. Like
that's what they have. So you're going to get a lot of it.
That's what they have, and you're interviewing the band now, and it's like, hey, we're on tour. Come film us at whatever, and incorporate that. And this movie has a lot of that, and that's done sincerely. And it doesn't, in my opinion, it doesn't suffer. Like a lot of times you see that in rock docs where it's like you see them now and they're performing like their greatest hit or whatever, and then like it cuts back to them in 1982, and you're like, well, yeah, they suck now. Like this is so much better, right? Like that happens so many times when we're watching these movies, and it's like, can we just have less of the now and more of the then, because they're just not as good, and like I want to see them when they were young and cool and sexy. I mean, partly is that they were never young and cool and sexy. I mean, Russell was to an extent, but even so, it wasn't really like about that. It was always playing off of that image. So the fact, so they can age very gracefully.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, watching the footage of them now, I'm like, yeah, I'll go to their concert any day if I can. Like that. It looks great. It does not look like you would be watching it and be like, well, I wish I was seeing this in 1982 because that's when they were good.
Without question. But so between the stage performance and the sort of visual sensibility as depicted on their album covers, It's no surprise that at two different points in their that at least two different points in their history, they had heavy flirtations with film.
Right.
So they were in the works for a while on a movie with Tim Burton, an animated movie that they were going to be intimately involved with.
Before that was Jacques Tati.
And Jacques Tati.
I'm a big Jacques. I don't know what your Jacques Tati,
Tell me about Jacques Tati.
Jacques Tati is dope.
Okay.
Big fan of Jacques Tati.
Okay.
He's a French director, and that already is going to make people be like, okay, I'm going to go to sleep. Most of his movies, even though they're sound movies, are almost silent. Like there's very little talking. It's all about these like bits that are happening, but they're hilarious and bizarre. And he's just this.
You can see the sensibility
strange...
in that with Sparks already.
Yeah. He's this very strange character. He always plays this same kind of guy. He's in the movies, this like sort of bumbling uncle character. Like I mean, Mon and I years ago we went to I think the San Diego Museum of Photographic Art was doing a screening of its movie Playtime, which is like from the 60s. It's almost 3 hours long, and there's almost no dialogue in the movie. It's just like bits happening as this character stumbles through this weird world, and
like Mr. Bean.
Yeah, except good. and at the end of it, we both walked out, and it's like if he described that to us, like we both would have been like, maybe that sounds kind of boring, and we both were like, that was awesome. When can we see that again? Like, let's go buy the DVD. This is like, we can't wait to show this to our kid. It's just so good. And you could totally see how they. So shout out to Jacques Tati.
All right, good. I'm glad we did a moment on Jacques Tati. I had a note here that you'd really bring your film school degree
yes, I'm
to
a
bear
Jacques Tati head. Yes, Playtime, Mon Uncle, they're all great. Yes. Anyway.
Okay. Well, so that sounds like it makes a great deal of sense for them as a collaborator. And then Tim Burton, say what you will about what's happened in the years since, but at the time that they were working with him,
like 1992, whatever that was,
would have been interesting. The guy that like for them dabbling in Hollywood, and I don't say this just because Russell eventually adopts his mustache, but where is John Waters in their history? It seems like they would have a fantastic collaborative relationship with John Waters.
Yeah, but John Waters is very Sparks always was Sparks was always trying for mainstream acceptance. That's the one weird thing. As weird as they were never especially for a long time, like they were when the punk thing came along, they talk about how they didn't fit in because they were like this, their stuff was very composed, and it was seen as opposite of punk, even though later on people kind of recognized that there was a lot of similar sensibility.
And Thurston Moore specifically says that he always thought of Bad Beat as a punk record, and it was kind of surprising to him that Sparks weren't seen that way.
Yeah. So yeah, maybe there was some connection there, but yeah, Sparks. I don't know what's with John Waters. I guess would be maybe a good fit, but John Waters was kind of like in this low budge punk film indie world, and Sparks were already kind of like in the major record company recording contract world. They just never fit in.
Right.
But yeah, I could see the overlap there.
Yeah,
I could see that would be a good fit.
Yeah, and so frankly, I got to say the Edgar Wright relationship makes a great deal of sense.
Yes,
and I would venture to say it would be strange to me if this is the end of their relationship professionally.
Yeah. I mean, you could see that them doing music for one of his movies or something like that. I mean, it's it's a perfect fit.
Yeah. Okay. So something you just said gets to me to my biggest observation about Sparks through this movie. You mentioned that as odd as they were, or as outside of the mainstream as they were basically always seeking mainstream appeal. They were in the major label category. They were appearing on Top of the Pops. They wanted to chart. They they were reaching like pretty significant levels of fame and record sales in that time, right?
And on and off, maybe not in the U.S., but elsewhere.
And it's kind of weird in retrospect and we've talked about this for in other movies where like the answers seem obvious now. So I recognize that this maybe not hadn't seemed so obvious, but when they reach this like dark period in their career, like 88 to 94 or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
they are still seeking a new record label to break them again, to reintroduce them to the world, to they'll reinvent themselves in some way because that's what they always do. And there's like this 6-year period where basically nobody wants them, and they're kind of mystified by this because still all they know and want to do is to make music together in the same way that they always have been able to, and more or less had always been able to find an audience, even if it was a little bit weird. And eventually, later, coming close to the 2000s, they realize that this is no issue at all. And in fact, they can just create their own records on their own and hand it to a label, and a label will either put it out or they won't, and they'll do just fine. And it's so weird that they are having this like crisis, this dilemma in the most booming period of indie label music that there has ever been. That there was no thought that maybe they could depart from the major label record world, and that somebody, that Sub Pop or whoever would put out a Sparks record doesn't seem that hard for me to imagine. And that it's like kind of a weird thing that they needed a major label with a major release during that 90s period when, like, sure, it's like, Whitney Houston selling millions of copies, but like also, like Dinosaur Jr. is making weird albums that only nerds are buying at record stores,
Yeah, I think it kind of goes both ways, though, right? Like, I don't
Right.
think the Sub Pops or SSTs or whoever of the world were looking at these legacy artists,
It
and
would have been a weird
and
fit. It would have been a
and
weird thing to go to a legacy artist.
I
You're
mean, the
right.
first person that I can think of, and I'm sure there's other examples, who does that is when Rick Rubin like
Yeah.
starts making records with Johnny Cash, and before that, and that was like so mind blowing, like. Wait a minute. You're telling me this like guy that's doing stuff with Slayer and the Beastie Boys or whatever can like, sign and do work with, this 80-year-old country singer or whatever, like it was really weird at the time. I think nowadays we live in a world where like, first of all, with streaming, everything's compressed. So like it's
Yeah.
perfectly easy and normal for somebody who's a music fan and is coming up to listen to, Dua Lipa, but also the Beatles. Like what it's all on the same, it's all available a click away. And festivals do that too. It's not a surprise if you see
Yes.
a Paul McCartney playing a Coachella alongside Turnstile or some band that came out yesterday. Like it's just
Right.
total. We now accept that as
And
being perfectly normal, and it's all
and
flattened.
and even not only Paul McCartney, like the festival thing now is like you can imagine a bunch of bookers at a festival trying to best each other on who can bring the most obscure legacy act that
Right.
that they each have records of but no one has listened to in 10 years,
Sure.
and book them on their festival. Like that's a
Right.
level of prestige.
Yeah, but that didn't exist. Even at the time we're talking about, like the early 90s, like, okay, you had Lollapalooza, but all the bands that were playing Lollapalooza in those days were, of the relatively speaking, the same demographic, the same age. Like when I went to Lollapalooza in 94, like there
Yeah.
wasn't, I mean, maybe you would get Neil Young playing with Sonic Youth sometimes on
Yeah.
some shows,
Yeah.
like, things like that would happen, but
Yeah.
it was few and far between. And when it happened, it was notable. And, nowadays it's all kind of one big thing. But yeah, I think it kind of went both ways. I think if you came up in that world where the only option was to be on a major label and to make big pop singles that would then be on Top of the Pops, and, getting out of that mindset takes a lot of work. And to
Yeah.
their credit, they eventually figured it out.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Where basically what they say is like, Russell figured out that he had to teach himself how to be a music engineer, and then they could just make music in like Ron's house or whatever,
Right.
and they would just do that for the rest of their lives. and they didn't need, some cigar smoking guy to come along with a bunch of money to put them in a fancy studio. Like, they knew how to
Right.
do it themselves, but it took them a
Yeah.
long time. But like, there's a lot of other musicians that you could say, like, why did you stick with this? There's a lot of musicians in the 80s and 90s who were putting out, stuff where you would say, like, well, yeah, some A&R guy told you to do that, but you didn't have to. You could have just done it yourself. Look, Nirvana did it, or whoever. But
Yeah.
again, it went both ways. Like, the idea didn't kind of cross the brain barrier.
All right, I got two Talking Heads notes here.
Yes,
One, Beck. I believe this is Beck's first appearance on the Rock Docs program.
I believe so.
I would just like to say that it's, although not the most memorable from this movie, considerably more memorable than his record swapping discussion in the Jacob Dylan Laurel Canyon documentary.
Yeah, I'm on record that the Laurel Canyon documentary is terrible.
I agree that it's terrible, and I agree, and I also think that's the low point of a terrible documentary.
That is the worst part of any movie documentary I've ever seen.
Yes.
Maybe we'll talk about that in length someday, but let's not, tar Sparks' moment in the sun with that. But yeah, Beck comes off all right in this.
Yeah, he seems fine. And then Dave Weigel, Washington Post political reporter Dave Weigel, makes an appearance. My only guess is for the reason that he's here is perhaps he's a Sparks fan. That would make sense. But he wrote a book on prog rock, a large book on prog rock.
Yes, I've read this book. Yeah,
you did read that book. Is it good?
Yeah. It's good. Yeah, I'm trying. Okay, now I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but yeah, he talks about going on a prog rock cruise. It's pretty entertaining. Yeah, it's a good book.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe we'll get him on sometime to talk about a prog rock doc.
Yes. He does
prog rock docs. That's the name of our next podcast. Prog rock docs.
Yeah,
from the people who brought you rock docs.
Yeah.
Prog rock docs.
So anything else you have here? I mean, I would just say also one last thing, and I think we maybe hashed this over at the top, but like a screenplay of this movie, I think would make it seem just like the most straightforward rock documentary that there is.
Right.
Like,
yeah,
everything that differentiates it from a straightforward rock doc is in execution, is in detail and in tone. And that's I think it's pretty cool actually to see how good of a filmmaker Edgar Wright is, that he's able to take something so down the middle for the form and turn it on its head.
Well, I mean, it also, you got to give credit to the guys, Ron and Russell, because like they tell their own story in such a great way. Like, anytime they're telling a story about them encountering somebody in another country, Ron does a ridiculous foreign accent, which is hilarious. And when he's describing what he said, he describes himself as the like cornballiest American. He like exaggerates his own LA surfer dude accent like way beyond, and it is hilarious.
I mean, also like all the different people who want to get some. It reminds me of like Robert Hunter to some extent, or Dylan. Is how many people desperately want to get something out of Ron's lyrics, and he just won't give them an inch.
Right. Yes, he will not tell you what it's about.
He's like everybody's got like, well, they're like psychoanalyzing him and what he's saying about his brother and how we're supposed to read this, and he gives nothing. It's great.
It's totally deadpan.
Totally deadpan. He's devilish about it.
Yeah, and it's not like Dylan where he's inarticulate. Like, Dylan is the greatest writer in like maybe the last 500 years in the history of the English language, but he cannot speak about things in certain things. Once in a while he makes sense, but a lot of times he just cannot put words together in prose in a way that communicates with other human beings. You get the sense that Ron knows exactly what it's all about, that he could tell you, that he's told, as soon as the camera's off, he will tell Edgar exactly what a song is about, but he will not break character.
Right.
And it's so good. I do want to give a shout out. I want to do like a little Talking Heads parade, because there are so many great Talking Heads in this movie that I want to shout out. Okay, so we've got Jane Wiedlin from the Go-Go's. Now, she did a song, Cool Places, in the early 80s with Sparks, and in which they
had a little affair with Russ.
Yeah,
seems
yeah, yeah.
like.
In which in the video they invented the dance that ended up being the Molly Ringwald dance, which was a big
Yeah,
deal for me and
yeah.
for my generation. So they have a little bit of hey, we invented that. We never got credit for it. But yeah, she talks about how she had a brief. She was in love with Russell, like way before she met them. She was a fan of Sparks and like had his poster on the wall. Then she met them. They had a brief affair. And now she looks back and she's like, Russell's great, but I really wish I had gone for Ron. Like, she's like, I went for brains over beauty. It's not that Ron's not beautiful or Russell's not smart. It's just, a different like she's trying to catch
Yeah,
herself. It
like,
is so
ah.
charming.
Yes,
It's
yes,
so
yes, yes.
winning.
Right.
I mean, really, I was saying earlier, but like all the former bandmates that they played with, even if they got like unceremoniously dumped, just seem like cool people, like
Yeah.
and also very sweet people. Like they just have surrounded themselves with like genuinely nice people their entire life. But who else comes off really good? The guys from Duran Duran are great. There's a lot of other musicians who are probably a lot more commercially successful who show up in this, who are just like falling over themselves and admitting to have ripped everything off from Sparks. Vince Clarke from Erasure and Duran and Depeche Mode, the guy Nick and John from Duran Duran. It goes on and on and on. The only people
It
who
pains
apparently
me to go
the only
ahead.
people
What
who
do you-
won't admit apparently to have having ripped off Sparks is Pet Shop Boys, who get called out in the movie for not having done so in
Yes.
another hilarious kind of animated bit. But there's just tons and tons of it.
Yes. It pains me to say I think Jack Antonoff comes out off pretty good.
Yeah, even
I
Antonoff.
even Jack Antonoff comes off well. If you want a taste of just how charming this movie is, it'll make you like Jack Antonoff.
I almost was expecting to see Moby show up and like what he had to say.
Warm feelings for Moby.
Fortunately, we were spared Moby, but yeah, everybody comes off great in this movie.
Schwartzman is doing the full Schwartzman, and he's pretty good. I would say. I mean, I think Flea's great. So the whole bit of the whole section where they talk about hooking up with the producer, Giorgio Moroder,
Yeah,
where they like, it's easy to overstate these things, and I'm certainly not well versed enough in the history and other bands that were doing what at this time to say anything more definitive than the movie says, but it does seem like they are very responsible for creating that synth sound that dominated in the 80s, or that they were sort of instrumental in that. And it's interesting that then they come back and start doing it again, and they're criticized for like trend surfing, a trend that they
right.
helped create.
Well, the story, if true, is great. That basically
Yeah.
like somebody asked them in like 1979 or something, like, "Hey, so are you working with anybody?" And they're like, "Yeah, we're working with Giorgio Moroder, who was like the
Yeah.
biggest producer in the world. Like he was doing Donna Summer,
Donna
like these
Summer.
great, classic disco songs." And and like somehow that got back to him, and he's like, "Yeah, I'd like to work with them. That sounds great." And one way or the other, he ended up producing their next album, and they were like baffled that happened.
Yes.
And it ended up being the number one song in Heaven, which is one of their biggest hits. I guess it was like in France, like it was the song of the
Yeah.
summer in like 1980 or whatever.
And that's like another song that's like a very like internal sense of humor. Like number one song in Heaven is like it's very difficult to explain the joke there, but
right.
I'm sure, I have no doubt that everybody who liked Sparks immediately thought that was very funny.
Right. But if you're just like doing coke in some disco in 1980 in France, and you hear some guy that you assume is some British guy singing about heaven,
Yeah.
like you're not. It
You
doesn't
don't care.
matter.
Doesn't matter.
And that's
Doesn't matter.
okay.
Doesn't
Like
matter. Yeah.
that also is
It's
fine.
like Beastie Boys. It's like when you mentioned with Beastie Boys.
Right. Any of these
Yeah.
bands that like where you can just enjoy it, and it doesn't matter if you're like
Yeah.
a nerd who's digging into the lyrics. That's fine. But yeah,
Um,
in those early those couple songs that we mentioned, it's definitely sets the tone for the 80s, and then you get every star from the 80s coming on and saying, yeah, we stole it from them.
Yeah.
And and just made a lot more money.
In terms of standout talking heads, Scott Aukerman and Patton Oswalt are both very good as well.
Yes.
And I think if you like listen to these types, these people that are like comedians and actors, musicians, producers, and producers that are new, producers that are old, musicians that are old. it could come across as very curated, like a very intentionally put together group of people that would be grading, and it doesn't in practice. It just does not come across like that at all. It seems to come across as like a very rational group of people to talk about a very odd band, because that this is the type of odd assemblage of people that this band would attract, and so that this is actually representative of the fan base, this sort of assortment of people.
Right. It's yeah, if you watch the trailer, you might think like, well, it's just Edgar Wright getting his famous friends together,
Yeah.
for a laugh or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's no, it everybody who's there serves a purpose and
Yeah.
moves the narrative along in some way. And I mean, I think this is Edgar Wright's best movie, if I'm being honest. I mean, I'm sort of biased in a way, and I haven't seen Last Night in Soho's last movie, so I can't speak about that one. And I'm a big fan. I saw Shaun of the Dead in the theater, and I was like, "What is this? Who is this guy? This is incredible." And
Yeah.
I've followed him along all the way, so it's not like I don't like his other movies.
Yeah.
Some are better than others, but World's End I really like. And but yeah, I think maybe this is his most accomplished of the ones I've seen, most well put together film from beginning to end that has the least amount of flaws or the least amount of, I don't know, shtick or whatever. It's great.
One last thing I want to say about Sparks: 21 concerts in a row where they did 21 different albums. That's insane.
Terrifying.
It's insane. Like, I'm glad I saw this, because it's going to keep me from saying a lot of reckless shit about Phish's Baker's Dozen. I'm really glad to know that this happened out there, so I can temper my praise for my favorite band about one of their crowning achievements.
Yeah. So
because
about
this is
yeah.
This
So
is
what
amazing.
happened was 10, 15 years ago, Sparks decided for some reason to do a run of concerts. To do a run of concerts in London, where every single night they would perform one of their albums, like in sequence, every single one of their 21 albums at that time. And then for the encore, they would do the B-sides. So they had to learn like 2 hours of music every night for 21, and they spent months rehearsing it. So they recorded a new album. And then the day they were done making the album, they got together with their band and spent 4 months learning every song that they've ever written, which was like 280 songs.
Yeah,
and then they
like
performed them one at a time, like no chance, no break, no take a break, no, whatever, like just one after the other. And just watching the video, like the clips of like every night, even though I've seen this movie now multiple times, it's still terrifying.
It's
like,
amazing.
I'm on the edge of my seat to see if this could possibly, it's like watching one of those stunts in a Tom Cruise movie, that is real, or Jackie Chan or something, where you're like, oh my God, is this, even though I've seen this before, like I don't know if it's going to work. Is this guy going to die? It kind of feels like that when you see them on stage.
I mean, I really had always thought that Phish's Baker's Dozen was one of the most amazing things that a band had ever done. And this is like arguably more impressive what they did here. And so now I just want to figure out, I just want a genuinely comprehensive list of these sorts of feats. What other bands have done something along these lines? Because man, it is I just can't imagine how they did it.
Yeah, I mean, like Guided by Voices did a concert a few years ago where they did a New Year's Eve concert where they did 100 songs in like their show. And their songs are like 2 to 3 minutes long.
How many songs did they play when you saw them a month ago?
52. Yeah, Bob said we're going to play 52 songs tonight, and if you don't like it, well, then we'll pay 53. So, yeah, 52, I think. Yeah. So, but that's not uncommon for them. Again, short songs. But yeah, that's one night.
Right.
Then you're done. But to do it 21 nights in a row, like imagine the first night, like, okay, we got through the first album. Great. Yeah. Now we got to do this 20 more
times. And covering
insane.
From like 1971 through
totally different
2010.
Different styles of music.
Yeah.
Totally, like
they had different bands doing that in real time. They had different bands doing it.
Even now, it seems terrifying that this happened. So, hats off to Sparks. Andy, I think we know the answer to this one. If somebody's not particularly a fan of Sparks, but they just seem like an interesting type of person that's open minded and into cool shit. Would
Yeah.
you recommend they watch this movie?
I would. Enthusiastically. I got nothing else to say. Yeah.
I mean,
It's
obviously,
too good not to.
It's
Yeah.
great. It's great. These guys are
The
hilarious.
only people I would not recommend this to are people who suck. They might have a tough time with it.
That's true. Unfortunately,
and they're out there.
If you're listening to this and you suck,
yeah, and you've made it this far,
you're an hour into this podcast. You're like,
just to be insulted at the very end.
Anyway, yeah, I now find myself listening to a lot more Sparks and watching this movie, and it has enriched my life. That is not a bit. I'm serious. It is. I'm feel like a more whole person because this exists in the world, and because now I'm digging their music, and it's a beautiful thing. So people, check out this movie. We recommend it.
I really got to say that the rewatchability on this has got to be at the top of everything that we have reviewed so far on this program.
Absolutely. Okay, we are at Rock Docs Pod on Twitter and Instagram, and we occasionally appreciate it when people leave us a review on iTunes and stuff like that. So if you feel like that's a thing that you felt like doing today, we appreciate if you do it. We appreciate all your feedback and comments and complaints and all the other things that we hear from people. But yeah, thanks for listening to Rock Docs.